Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Keys. I'm the founder and CEO of the KPO Group, which is a company based in Belize with an operating office in Canada. The KPO Group essentially is in the business of getting projects done. And we have been in operations for about 3 years. And we have come across, over that time, over 100 projects across the world looking for financing. And we've come to an understanding of what is it that makes a project successful when it comes to getting money, which is the most critical aspect of any project execution. So this presentation today is intended to give you a brief yet comprehensive overview of what to expect and how to go about getting financing, and especially in terms of development of the data, information, and documents that are required by private groups, private equity groups, financiers, VCs, and so-called family offices, who will be assessing and deciding whether or not this is a project worth investing. This is a brief overview of the business. As I said, we're in the business of mainly helping project owners secure financing, and once it's secured, help them deliver that project either directly by managing it on their behalf or consulting or advising them throughout the execution process. In emerging markets, we also have the capability of providing training and development for both people and companies who are interested in taking a part in these projects that are being developed in their regions. Most of the projects that we deal with are what I call capital projects. So these are usually large value projects. Minimum is typically 50 million. And they essentially build what I call a physical asset that produces revenues. So it'll be a power plant, it'll be a solar power generation plant, it'll be a water treatment system, it will be a monorail for a city transport. It can be a real estate development in the form of a resort, a hotel, or some commercial buildings. The variety of projects is significant. And as I said, we work across the world, and we favor projects that are outside of North America. We do have the ability to also help businesses with much smaller financing needs in the $1 to $10 million range under the enterprise group. And we will also participate in what I call social impact projects, which are essentially meant and designed to improve the lives of specific groups of people in a region. Financing is essentially the end-all be-all of projects. No amount of visions and missions and statements will do anything if the project is not financed. And it's not just getting financing, it is getting the proper amount of financing in the proper format. And there are two ways to do this. It's essentially debt or equity. And in both cases, this financing is provided by what we call private investors. We do not deal with banks or governments or so-called world banks and institutional investors. It's always private equity money that is interested in getting into the financing business. Now, debt is by far an easier proposition than equity. And I will be showing you in a minute the difference between project financing and equity and startup financing. And it's dramatically different. When it comes to projects, you are not pitching some glamorous new widget, some new idea, trying to change the world. In the project financing business, it's all about building the asset that will generate revenues. And for that reason, those who supply the financing are typically more interested in providing debt than equity, although some will take some equity positions in a project, usually at the minority position. I should add as well that for purposes of efficiency today, I will not be taking questions. So if there's any questions about any of the comments or text that appears on the screen, you are welcome to send me an email after, and I will be happy to provide you the answers. My email address will appear at the back. Now, here's the key to understanding the difference between project financing and what I call startups. The world of startups, innovations and startups, is always in the news, the business news, in the corporate world, in the corporate news. It's always what we hear about. And there's a whole different world and approach to be adopted when it comes to startup financing. Sorry about this. Project financing is ultimately about making money for the investor as soon as the project is finished. There's no aspirations of greater visions or changing the world as a primary motivation to invest. It's all about generating revenues for the investor as soon as this asset is acting, operating, or generating revenue. This is profoundly different than startups, which are always based on a promise of a future revenue sources that are unestablished, unquantified. They are simply guessed at. And there's a hope, and it's truly a hope, that these guesses and promises will actually materialize over time. Another significant difference between project financing and startups is that the end game of a startup is really undetermined. Nobody, even though there's always a pitch that will say, we expect to be cash flow positive in 2.5 years, whatever the number. Startups can never tell for sure that they will hit that deadline or timeline. The revenues and the profits afterwards are always at some distant future, which cannot be quantified and put into a calendar today. A project, by definition, is started and finished within an expected timeline, a scheduled timeline, so that one can start predicting with accuracy and reliability the kind of revenues that will be produced over the first 3, 6, 12, and later years. That is a key difference, and that is why investors are more interested in getting into debt financing, because they know that the cash flow will be there to support the reimbursement of the debt. Whereas equity, it's basically a shot in the dark in all cases. EBITDA for a project investor is the king. If there's no realistic way of looking at positive cash flow for the entirety of your operational life of the asset, the project will not go forward in terms of financing. If they put equity in the project, and it's usually a minimum of 20%, all the way up to 30%. Typically, that is what we have seen. Those equity investors will also have the kind of expectations that you see in a startup, meaning within 2 years after starting operations, they expect to have doubled the value of the investment. They expect to, and these, by the way, these are rules of thumb. They're not hard rules, but those are kind of expectations that we've seen over the years. So it's either double by year 2, triple by year 4, or multiply by 5 by year 7. But at all times, EBITDA and annual profits are expected and demanded from the investors. Oh, sorry. So how do you succeed in getting this financing? The first thing that you must understand that is also different from startups is that the vision, the mission, the connections, the political connections, the top talent on your team really don't matter at all. And that is a critical point. They don't matter at all if you are not able to present the case that your project is investment grade, that it's bankable. It's all about bankability. And that is completely different than a startup. You don't need or expect to do a 5-minute pitch with 12 slides and make your case in an elevator to a would-be investors. That's not how it works. It's all about the bankability of the project. There's a lot of money in the world floating. I mean, there's an enormous amount of money looking for a place to invest in terms of projects. The challenge is not the money. It's always finding what I call investment grade projects. To get there, you and the onus is on the project owner to validate, prove, and quantify the bankability of this project. And this is done in 4 steps. The first one is, and I'll describe that in the next few slides. The first step is bankability. Basically, is there a business case in the idea that you're presenting? Is there really money to be made out of the asset that you're intending to build? And if so, what are the conditions and what are the terms under which this project will be successful in terms of revenues? The execution part is not the overriding concern when it comes to financing. It will get done. With enough money, you can always finish a project. It is not about how cheap you can get it built. It's about how much money this asset will make over its lifetime. And that also affects significantly the way you approach this design and concept. After you've proven the bankability, you need to get into the financing stage, which is essentially putting together the package of data, documents, and various informations and projections that will be demanded by the investors to be for review, and upon which the decision to invest will be made. Part of that documentation also includes the execution strategy before you start doing it. The investor wants to know, what will the money be used for? Because the money is all about building this asset, designing, building, procuring, fabricating, getting permits, getting licenses, doing environmental studies, doing marketing studies, whatever. There are uses of the money that must be identified upfront and precisely defined, not just wishy-washy. We think we're going to put 2.5 million on doing this or that. It has to be precise, and to convey the impression that this project is well structured, well planned, and its strategy of execution is sound. Once the capacity has been established, the plan has been structured properly, and the financing is in place, the last part is to deliver this project, which is building it and then bringing it up to speed in terms of operations, which, by the way, always includes training, setting up all the supply chains at the front end before you turn on the power. This is something that very often is overlooked by a lot of project developers. Here's a more detailed timeline of what I call a project lifecycle from a financing standpoint. And again, we have our 4 stages here. Number 1, bankability. Capitalization is where you get your money. Number 3 is delivery, where you build the asset. And number 4 is the operations, essentially generating revenues. You'll see there in blue, under the line that's called purpose. That is basically what is this phase 4? What is its purpose? And the first one is there a business case, as I mentioned? The outcome of the first stage is a feasibility study, which is based on a large number of constraint analyses, concept development, and assumptions that I'll review shortly. The second stage, capitalization, starts with a proper formulation of the project from an application standpoint. This is the funding application standpoint. The full definition of the strategy to execute if you get the money, and also the actual process of applying for the financing, which varies significantly from one investor to the other. The outcome of phase 2 is what I call the investor prospectus, which is similar in intent, although not in content. But in intent, it is similar to what you would see when somebody is proposing an equity raise for a business, and a prospectus is put together to justify this equity raise. The third stage, delivery, is about the design and the building of things. This is where you're spending the money that you received. The end result of which being the operating asset. Now, it's critical to understand that it's not just building something. You can build it if at the end of the day, by the time you spent your money, your asset is not ready to generate revenues. You have a dead anchor on your head. And a project like this is exceedingly difficult to salvage, because by that time, the money is spent, and it's very difficult to make the case to future investors that it's worth risking it, since you failed to deliver on the strategy that you proposed on the front end. However, once you've built this operating asset, the next step is to actually bring it to revenue status, to operational status, which includes startups, where you're getting things together, getting ready, hiring the people, getting the processes in place, getting the contracts in place with all your logistics participants, your supply chain partners, and then turn on the key and start producing whatever it is that this asset is producing or transforming. And at the end of the day, the outcome of the phase 4 is returns on investment. Again, you have to keep in mind that when we talk about project investing, it is not about your vision. It's not about the impact of the project on society. The only perspective that matters is this asset making money for the investors? It's always about the investors. If you make the case and you get your money, you will succeed with a project and you will make your money. However, you will never get there if you cannot prove to the investor that your project is investment grade, produces what amounts to an annuity when it comes to ROIs, and increases their equity stake over time. Now, I'll rapidly go through these. I'll just flash the various details of the 4 stages, just to give you a sense what is involved in the work that goes into completing each stage. And here for stage 1 is making the case. Is there a case there? Is there money to be made? And if that's the case, to what amount, to what scale, to what amount, to what timeline, and how much money you think you're going to need to get there. A lot of the feasibility study can be looked at a constraint analysis. What stands in the way of making this project a success? You will do marketing studies. You will do various environmental assessment. Those are really, the outcome is usually predictable and that you can show that there's a business case to be had, but it's the constraints on the project that will make it or kill it from the get-go. If you're trying to build something in an area that is environmentally sensitive, with the odds of getting approval from the regulator down to 0, there's absolutely no point in going there and trying to spend any money proving it. If the regulatory environment is against your project, there's no point in putting any effort in it, because no investor will be willing to wait 2, 3, 5, 10 years, as we've seen in Canada, for instance, in oil and gas and mining projects. No investor is willing to waste that time waiting for an answer. So constraints drives the feasibility of a project at the front end. Under stage 2, so we're trying to get to the prospectus here, the investor prospectus. And the purpose of stage 2 is very simple: securing financing, getting the money that you need to get this project done. And I'll be talking about there's basically debt and equity. I'll be describing this in a few seconds. But all this work, all of this information that you see on the screen needs to be compiled, needs to be developed before you get to talking to an investor. You'll need a PowerPoint to present the project, obviously. You'll need some basic financial projections. You'll need a team presentation. You'll probably need as well a project presentation. But those are the last pieces of the puzzle. If you strictly rely on a PowerPoint that presents the project in this glorious fashion without any substantial quantitative data to support it, that PowerPoint is a waste of time. And again, this is where it's very different than startups, where the PowerPoint, the pitch deck, as we call them, the pitch deck can be put together in a very snazzy way and convince people to put money in it. In projects, that won't work. Nobody cares about the pretty pictures on a slide if the financial statement, the financial predictions don't add up, or if the strategy makes no sense. Stage 3 assumes that you've received the money, and now it's basically getting down to business and then building this thing. And usually by that stage, you have not completed the design, the detailed design of your project. You've only had enough money to move forward with some feasibility study and some basic concept development, what it's most likely going to look like. You haven't got any fine details on how to build this thing. You're not ready to build. So that's the very first step of stage 3, is to get into conceptualization. In parallel with this, you'll start procuring, buying, and issuing purchase orders and contracts to buy materials, secure consulting services, consultants, constructor, fabricators, buying the land that you're proposed that you need to get to for your project. Because usually most projects don't have the land yet. They've negotiated with the landowner for and agreed on a sales price, but they usually don't have the money up front prior to financing to purchase this land. So land purchase is basically almost the first thing that happens after you have financing in place. And of course, you get to realization, which is getting in the field and building stuff. And finally, with something that happens in parallel with all the other 3, is the commercialization of this project, which has nothing to do with building or designing, and everything to do with the legal structure of this business, as well as the contractual relationships with your supply chains when it comes to feedstock agreements and offtake agreements. So who's supplying the raw materials for your project to operate, and who's buying your output? Now, if it's a hotel, for example, the output is you're selling rooms, you're selling vacation packages. That's the output. So that's the offtake. This is about the only exception to the rule of having to know upfront who your off-takers are, because you're building it hoping that somebody will come. You also need to figure out and set up the management of the company that will run this project. And when you are dealing with in the emerging markets, less developed areas of the world, there's always a component of what I call project ecosystem buildup. When you build something, especially that's new to the area, there's a whole world of supply chain support that doesn't exist, that needs to be built up. Where are you getting your parts? Where are you getting your basic materials, your raw materials? Where are you getting your expertise to maintain, repair, install, or even test and calibrate some of the equipment that you're going to be using? There's a mountain of questions that go into defining this project ecosystem requirements, and that has to be defined at this stage. And finally, many projects are controlled by strict regulatory constraints. You can think of greenhouse gas emissions, GHGs. That's one. You can think of water pollution or water contamination. You can think of environmental stewardness. Whatever it is, there is a need for the project to understand all of the regulatory constraints that will be placed on the project, and how you will meet these regulatory constraints and satisfy the regulator. And by satisfy, I mean meeting the legal obligations. I'm not talking about greasing the rails. We don't deal with this with projects that are basically working on a corruption basis to get anything done. But there's still a lot of compliance requirements that must be met. And finally, in operations, you've built the thing, you're ready to get started, and there's a few things that you need to do before you actually turn on the power and start making money. And there's a list there. It is not an extensive list. Every project has its own unique requirements that will need to be defined and added in this section in stage 4. And part of stage 4, before the end of stage 3 is done, the marketing strategy begins. Now here it's shown on step 2 under activation. You'll see there's this business of marketing blitz, website rollout. And in other words, anything that deals with advertising. This will have started roughly before the end of stage 3, so that by the time you're ready to turn on the keys to the plant or the asset, that has already been out in the public, and there is market awareness of what this project is. However, the bulk of it is done while you're getting ready to turn the operations. You don't want to do it too early, because if you are planning if you announce a date of an opening date or a startup date, that it gets missed because construction didn't complete on time, it really has a severe impact on the credibility of your marketing efforts. So it is critical that once you start putting out into the public domain your marketing, your advertisement for the project, and telling the world that it's about to come online, you have to be certain that the dates that you claim in those marketing campaigns will be met on the day that they arrive. All of this work throughout all the stages require a lot of effort, a lot of labor, most of it hired, and most of it supplied by contractors, consultants, and supply chain partners. This is not work that is done by the project team looking to get the money. There's just too much. There's an immensity of work there. So the point of the financing is to not try to do all of this work up front, because you do not have the resources, and you're unlikely to have the expertise in all the fields required to be addressed to make a credible pitch. Now, there are some rules when you start to engage investors. Investors are constantly solicited for money by projects, by people. It's a world where getting hassled is a business, not constrained, but it's something you have to put up with. A lot of private investors, as a result, operate anonymously. They don't advertise themselves. They don't tell the world who they are, what they're looking for, what they want, how they're going to engage in anything. They remain anonymous for the simple reason that they don't want to be bothered with a constant pestering of people clamoring for money. Once you have been able to connect to an investor and intrigue him enough, or her, intrigue her enough to listen to your pitch, then there's some unspoken rules that you will have to abide by in order to satisfy the investor's requirements. Again, your focus is not on the project, it's on the investor. What does the investor need to invest in your project? What does he expect from you in terms of time, commitment, answers, responses? And what is his expectation when it comes to dealing with you? It's all about the investors. And so this is the most important thing you need to learn from this whole presentation. It's always from the perspective of the investor that everything you do is put together. Now, there are what I call, there are 7 prime directives when it comes to the rules of engagement. I've listed them here. You cannot waste investors' time. Rule number 1, if the investor says, yes, I'm interested in your project, and ask you, let's meet on a certain date, at a certain time, and give me the answers to this, you cannot miss that date or request a change unless you're going to be in hospital or something. But if you said yes to a meeting, you have to be sure that you will be there and have all of the information requested by the investor when you meet. If you show up and you're waffling, you don't know, you haven't prepared, this is the last time you'll hear from the investor. You have one shot at this with an investor. He will not give you a second chance. If you don't come through and immediately establish your credibility, you will not get a second chance, no matter how great your project could be. Investors are risk adverse, despite their willingness to put money into projects, which by themselves is a very risky proposition, especially when we're talking about large amounts of money. The investor is supremely concerned about various risks to their reputation, which is number 2 there. Risk to their capital. It's not just the first rule of investing is not making more money in the end, is to be able to take your money out if you want to, all of it, not part of it, all of it. So that's preservation of capital. They want to be certain that once you are given the money, that there will be a certainty in the terms of execution, that there's not going to be any hidden delays, any sudden surprises that are going to wreck your schedule or your budget that you didn't think of. And that speaks to the strategy of execution that needs to be defined at the front end. During construction, because construction is always where budgets get busted up. If they break somewhere, it's during construction. And construction contains 90% of the expenses of a project, roughly. So it's an enormous amount of money that's sitting at risk and is being consumed every day that the construction is going on. You have to have a credible execution strategy during construction that will alleviate the risk of slippages and that will provide a high degree of certainty that this execution will run according to schedule. Nobody asks for foolproof or guarantees, absolute guarantees of completion, because that doesn't exist. There's no investor that's going to demand an absolute dead timeline, come hail or high water, because these people, if there's seasoned investors, they know that projects are prone to variations, to vagaries of randomness that sometimes affect things. So they are aware that things may not come under exactly on schedule or on budget, but they certainly will not tolerate a project that's going to double in length because it was poorly planned. Another risk that they absolutely will insist on is the risk of not making money. They're putting their investment for one thing, is to make money. It's not about changing the world. It's not about doing things. These are secondary, and they can play a role in their decision to invest, but it's not the primary role, the primary reason why they put money in. They put money into a project because they want to make money from it. So that's number 6 there, is once it's built and ready to go, they want to be certain that this asset will actually start making money. Maybe not, will start generating revenues with a predicted path through profitability, which is different than number 7. A PPA is basically a profitably performing asset. It is not enough to just make revenues year in, year out. It has to maximize the sustained long-term returns on investment of the asset, which is very different. The first one, number 6, basically speaks to building an asset that will work as intended from the get-go. That's what number 6 is. Number 7 says this asset will not only work from the get-go, but it will work as designed throughout its entire economic life, which is a very different thing in the sense that it changes the way you design you approach your design. Final point, if you're trying to be a slick car salesman, hey, how you doing? And just trying to overdo it, you will turn them off, because this is not a sales pitch. You're making a case for the credibility of your project. They expect integrity, they expect honesty and if you don't know something, they would much rather have you say, I don't know the specific answer, but I'll get back to you within 2 days, something like this. But if you're nonchalant about their question, or you're dismissive of their objections or questions, then you are certain to turn them off, and they'll just, again, you get one shot at this. If they're not interested, or if they get put off by your presentation, they're not going to bother, because there's 100 other ones waiting in line for the next month to be attended to. This is an important question. When should you ask for money? Now, obviously, you can't just go out as soon as you have the idea, because nobody will give you money to develop your idea. That doesn't happen, other than families and friends, and maybe some government programs that are targeting that certain economic development in a region. Usually, the idea is not enough. You need to do a whole lot of work up front to come up with a so-called bankability definition and making your case that your project is investment grade. So, first of all, you ask for money once it is proven bankable, not before. If you go before, it's very difficult to get anybody to put in it, because it becomes like a startup guess. It's a gamble, and the unknowns are too many, too high, and generally too off-putting for investors to be interested. And if they do put money in at that stage, they will demand an equity position from the get-go, which you may not be interested in giving up. And the second point is, you ask for the money long before you actually need it. The worst time to be asking for money is when you've either run out of it and you need more, or you started the work not knowing that we're going to need that money, and now you have an urgent need for cash. It is the worst possible time to do this, because it speaks to a lack of planning, a lack of proper strategy, a complete lack of execution understanding. It just paints a very, very bad picture of you as a promoter of a project. So, long before you need the money means the money to build the whole thing. This is the money, what I call for that you will ask at stage 2 to design and build the project. You still need money at the front end to do the feasibility study. And this money will have to come from somewhere, usually not from investors. Finally, when faced with a multitude of projects, investors in projects prefer this. They have a definite preference for what I call the level of maturity of a project, in terms of how close are they to generating revenues. So it is not about first to market, which is common in startup strategies. It is not about the vision thing, and it's not about promises of great market share 5 years from now. They need to know, how soon will my money start generating revenues? And that qualifies everything they do when it comes to assessing your project. So we've developed a categorization of classes. There's 5 classes from A to E, A being the most appealing to investors. When you've done all the work, and I'll show you the slide the next, when all the design work, procurement, fabrication has been done, and you're ready to construct, which usually means probably about 50 to 60% of your total budget. When you're that close, almost all of the risk has been eliminated from the project, other than construction risk. And that's when it becomes more appealing. At the end of construction, this is no longer project financing, by the way. If you build it and now you're looking to sell it, this is no longer a project. This is a business transaction. So it's a different model altogether. So class A is shovel ready. Class E is idea or vision formulated. And it succeeds, as I said, on a project basis. It's almost impossible to get money from investors. The earliest an investor may be willing to put money is at class D, when you need the money to do some feasibility and marketing studies, or you've already started this work, and you still need a bit more money to complete some studies that were unexpected. That is when that's about the earliest time that they're willing to do this. So everything in between will depend on the quality of your data to convince an investor that it's worth their time. Once you are ready to present, this is for stage 2, making your case. This is basically the information that will be asked from you by the investor to supply, and they will not wait for you to develop it. This has to be ready before you ever reach the point where you're going to be talking to an investor. All of this information is required, and sometimes more. Now, what is critical to understand here, and it's highlighted in yellow, it is not enough to put together the documentation. Now, people will develop marketing plans and business plans, basically Googling the templates and then filling out the blanks. The credibility of the information is absolutely and unconditionally essential to the credibility of your pitch, of your project. If you have improvised your data, if you've tried to save money by doing everything yourself, not knowing what you're doing really, and just doing Google searches and trying to grab numbers and data that support your idea, this will be apparent to a seasoned investors. Remember, these people have been in the business forever, well, for decades or years. They have seen innumerable projects. They know what is a credible project presentation, and they know what is pretentious, or basically hot air. So it is absolutely essential to the credibility of your project, that the information that is required here is developed by professionals, by people who understand and know each of the fields that are required to do this work. You cannot develop this all yourself. If you do, it will show, and you will not be credible unless you've done this 20, 30 times before, and that's a different story. But most people have not done this that many times. They're new or relatively new at the game, and they need to bring in the expertise to properly define the work in a manner that is credible. Think of it as going to court, and you're presenting evidence to the judge. If in a court proceeding, anything that smells of incredibility will be immediately detected and rejected. So if you try to save money by doing it all yourself, all you're doing is guaranteeing that you will be denied the financing. In addition to the classes of projects, in terms of assessment, investors like to work with projects that are cash positive. The ideal situation, from our experience so far, is you have at least 20% of your ask. The ask is how much money you want or you need for the project. If you have a minimum of 20% of the money in cash in a bank, or have access to this 20% once the financing is secured, then there's a number of private investors that will loan you the money at 5 times leverage. In other words, they'll take you 20%, put it in an escrow bank account that will be used strictly for paying down the debt, the interest on the debt, and in return, they will loan you 100% of the money that you're looking for. And these deals can be completed in 4 to 8 weeks. So they're exceedingly quick if you're able to do this. You don't necessarily need more. As interestingly enough, investors that provide debt financing are not interested in mezzanine debt or being a small loan. They like to loan all of it. So their preference is to loan between 80 and 100% of the ask. So having 50% of their money up front and asking for 50% loan is actually working against you in terms of success. It is better to go in, if you want to reduce your exposure a little bit, go with 25% cash upfront and request 100% financing. If you don't have that money, which is often the case, then the second best option is to have the ability to get some kind of guarantee instrument, a financial instrument that will guarantee the project, whether it's a so-called bank guarantee, a standby line of credit, a commercial promissory note, a surety bond, performance bond. There's a number of other items that some investors may ask or require. And if you're able to get that bond, let's call it guarantee, and it will usually be a bank that will provide this, or a bonds provider, one or the other. if you're able to get that guarantee upfront, and it will at least be 20%, but typically it'll be 50% of the ask. That's what if you're looking for $100 million, you want a guarantee of at least 50 million. If you're able to get this ahead of time when you meet the investor, then you will be exceedingly interested, because that reduces the investor's risk. Again, it's all about reducing the the risk to the investor. You will have to be prepared to accept some kind of equity. Even though I've said earlier that most investors prefer debt, very often they will ask for a minority position, a voting position, but a minority position all the way up, usually up to 20-25% of the value of the ask. You have to be prepared to do this. Most investors that we've dealt with have never asked for a majority position. So that is a good news for you. You remain in control of the project. Investors typically are not interested in running projects, in owning them and being burdened with the responsibility of making the project make money. That's not why they're in it. They only want to make money out of their investment. Some investors will ask for collateral just like banks would. Almost no investor will take your future asset as their collateral. They're not interested. It's not built yet. It's worth nothing to them. And finally, the odds of getting a project financing approved are greatly increased if you already have all the permits and licenses fully granted by the applicable authorities. If you have some, environmental studies, for example, environmental permits can always be a real thorn in the side of a project owner. And if the government, if it's not in hand, and there's some sense that there's some issues with it, that is a giant risk to an investor, and that will be a red flag. Another one is what's called the stakeholder engagement, which usually means getting agreement from landowners owners of land surrounding the area where your project will be built, need to be consulted or even need to approve your application. It's like in Canada, this is frequent, unfortunately, in a sense that people with no stake in a project have veto power over the project. But that is how it is here. So if these permits are not in hand and run a risk of being delayed or not granted, that is most likely going to result in a zero interest by the investor. They ask how much money you need. This is not a game. This is the most important thing you need to retain here. You do not lowball the project. You're not selling a widget. You're not selling something off the shelf. What you're selling is an asset that's going to make money in the future. What you need is a high level of certainty as to how much money you need to finish this project. And by finishing, I mean reaching the end of stage 4 when it's operating and already generating revenues. It's not when it's constructed. It is when it's generating revenues. So how much do you need? Now, there's always a certain amount of uncertainty in these budgets. And I've listed here so-called estimate classes, and you've seen that expression class when in the slide number 4 or 5, where it presents the details of the life cycle of the project financing process. These are published under AEEC, if you wish to know. It's an American standard. So these are basically level of uncertainties. The earlier the project, obviously, the higher the level of uncertainty. So you need to build a budget that basically has a so-called contingency budget to make up for the unknown. Now, the standard does list a plus-minus range. This is the red column called typical accuracy ranges, from -100, let's say for class 5, from -50% to +100%. You never pay attention to the negative number, simply because you will never see a project that's going to come in at lower than what you're projecting. You're better off going from the budget plus the upper limit that's listed, and that's your budget. If you come in at the end of the day, if you've come in below budget, then it's a phenomenal plus. But you never plan around a possible reduction of cost. It's budget plus the uncertainty range, the contingency, which is listed in the next column there. That budget has to be realistic. And it has also it is not about how cheap can you build your asset. If you take that approach, how now lowballing the budget so they're gonna this is the minimum I need to get something working. Getting something working won't cut it over the lifetime of the asset that's pretending to maximize long-term investment returns to the investors. Remember, it's about long-term ROI. This is what the investor is in. So what you need is spend not the least amount of money, but the most amount of money needed to achieve these maximum ROIs. Now, this is very different. If you've ever taken a course in project management, the PMP, for example, it's always the emphasis is always about coming in on budget and trying to do the most with as least as possible. That is a guarantee of failure long term. I draw your attention to the last point on this slide, number 5. Going cheap during development kills profitability. Or if you want to be even more succinct, going cheap now will cost more later. And the cheapest now costs the most later. And it's a simple explanation for this. It's listed under number 2. Over the lifetime of an asset, the money you spend in operating, maintaining, fixing, repairing, modifying, what have you, the so-called OPEX budget of an asset. The cumulative OPEX of an asset over its lifetime use of 20, 30, 50 years will be multiple times higher than the budget you spent on building this asset. So you're not saving any money in the long run by going cheap up front. If you buy, for example, just a simple example, a filter for water, don't buy as cheap as you can, because you're going to replace this thing constantly. And the more frequently you replace it, the higher your labor to do this, and the more downtime you end up with. If you have a big mechanical pump, that's pushing oil or some liquid, you want this pump to work 24/7, 350 days a year. You want this pump to never break, and when it does require so-called predicted maintenance, it needs to be down for as little as possible so that it's not offline longer than it needs to be. You will pay more for that pump up front, slightly more, not significantly more. You will pay more than the cheapest on the markets. You can always find a cheaper version of something, but it's all in the total cost of ownership, the TCOs. And that's what drives the ROI in the end. And we're nearing the end here, and I want to talk about the fees. Obviously, when you're engaging people and companies, investors, as well as KPO, there are fees involved. And there's no hard and fast rules here as well on who charges what. But you should expect, as part of your budgeting process, to get the financing. Now, this speaks to the fact that you need to have some money to pay for the fees that will be required sometimes upfront by an investor, typically for due diligence purposes, or if the investor is going to be looking to secure insurance policy and insurance on your project on the insurance market, there'll be some fees associated with that insurance policy. These fees will have to be paid by you. Most investors will have fees that are payable after the financing has been awarded, and it'll be built into the financing typically. Some investors will not. The due diligence in particular is often asked up front, and it can be $50,000, $10,000, $50,000. I've seen $100,000 fees for due diligence, and there's no choice. There's no negotiation there. You either pay up or they will not be interested. You can't. The worst fees are the ones that are coming through third parties. They're asking you for, we need $8,000 up front for this, or $5,000. If somebody asks for a $10,000 fee up front on a $100 million deal, it's a scam. It is that simple. Because in terms of percentage, that's a fraction of a penny on the value of the loan or the financing. It makes no sense. So there's a whole lot of scammers out there who will ask for fees up front. KPO, for example, has a fee structure, but it only gets paid if the financing has been secured. So there's a host of fees that you will be expected to pay if you get a guarantee, a bank guarantee, or standby line of credit, or a surety bond. There will be a fee of this. And so the list is not exhaustive here, but you have to plan for a few percentage points in your budget before you get to the completion of stage 2. And that pretty much concludes my presentation today. I went pretty quickly. There's a lot of material here, which I'd be delighted to go into more details with anybody who's interested. The messages I want to leave you with are threefold. Number one, in this process, it's only from the investor perspective that everything is prepared. It's not your vision, your dream, your changing the world. It's about the investor and his desire to make money. Number two, you will need to prove your bankability of the bankability of the project. And you cannot do this on a shoestring, because unless you're doing very small amounts, which are outside of our scope. But if you're going for 20 million, 50 million, we're dealing with some $900 million projects. You have to spend the money to hire the expertise that is required to properly define the information that will build up into a bankability proof. And the third one is you will need some money upfront to do all this work. Feasibility, for example, a feasibility study will run you between 0.5 and 1% of the eventual ask. So, and that money will have to be found somewhere. There's some fees that will have to be paid. You will not get financing if you have zero money put in, and you have zero money to put into the project. You're expecting somebody to finance all of it, but you retain control. That is not going to happen. So that's it. I thank you very much for your time. Again, my name is Stephen Keys, and here's my contact information. I am operating out of Canada, but I vary my location throughout the year depending on where the projects are. And I thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to hearing from anybody if you had a question. Thank you.